Now we're moving on to firmer ground, cottagism in Upper Mesopotamia, also known as the Jazeera.
Yeah.
Chase Robinson, in his book, chapter 5 of his book on cottagism, mentions that the local tradition of cottagism in the Jazeera starts with a figure named Salih ibn al-Masari, who raised a revolt in
Hmm.
695. This guy is a very difficult figure to find information about. I didn't find anything on him in the Encyclopedia of Islam. I didn't see, or unless I'm incorrect, and I just wasn't, I didn't know how to look for him in the encyclopedia, but I couldn't find anything on him. And he doesn't have a Wikipedia page. Maybe you might find things about him in other sources, but do we have an origin story for Salih ibn al-Masari?
Saleh, yeah. Saleh is a very interesting figure. So Tabari has a little bit on him, and some of the other sources as well. So we know him mainly as a very pious figure. So as an ascetic, a Quran reciter, someone who had a lot of religious knowledge. And this is, I mean, it's kind of the prototype of the Kharijite figure as we encounter it, at least some of the more prominent ones. Um, there may have been, I mean, he's certainly the main figure that sort of starts off the main chapter of Kharijism in the Jazeera. There may have been others before him, but again, none of this work has actually properly been done. So it's as I said, it's a very long laundry list of things to do for our group. But he's certainly the main figure, and yes, he had a reputation for piety, for religious knowledge, for as a scholar, basically. Um, it's for these figures, it's often very difficult to try and work out why they decided to take up arms, because usually it's explained with resistance to oppression and tyranny and injustice. Whether that stands and what is actually meant by that is something that I think we need to devote more attention to, because there are other such figures who are associated with him. So the next big one is Shabib ibn Yazid, who may have joined him, who may have been a part of Saleh's group and then took over after Saleh was killed, but who may also have had just an entirely separate revolt. The sources aren't very clear on that, or rather we get different presentations. But we also have a very interesting account in the source that I think still not enough people actually take into account, and that's Ibn Atham al-Kufi. And Ibn Atham has a very interesting account of Shabib, and actually another similar figure, basically going to Abdul Malik in Damascus, and basically trying to get concessions from him, and trying to get concessions for the Iraqi tribesmen, but he's not heard, essentially, and so he says, well, you'll see what the consequences are. Basically threatens him, and then goes back to the Jazeera and starts his revolt. This isn't to say that we should, automatically, prioritize an explanation like this, which perhaps sounds a little bit more plausible or seems to give more of the background story. But it's certainly worth investigating, because there's at least one other such figure who basically went to Abdul Malik to try and get concessions for him and for his people, was refused, and then went back and turned Kharijite. So it's I feel like I say it's difficult all the time, but it really is, especially because, again, a lot of the background work hasn't really been done yet, or hasn't been done to the extent that it is necessary. So Saleh seems to have been this very pious figure, who, according to most sources, I would say, took up arms because he opposed the injustice of the Umayyads.
So he wasn't a soldier. Because that was
He,
something me and Roxana were trying to
yeah,
figure out. Was he a soldier? Was he a soldier?
And not that I know of, which of course doesn't mean that he wasn't. I just may not have come across that information. Certainly Shabib was, and that is a very interesting thing that Robinson also points out, that we have figures like Shabib, and there are others who were part of the caliphal armies, were then dropped from the Diwan, and some of these either turned bandit or turn Kharijite. And then some would say there isn't really much difference between the two. But
Yeah, because
it's certainly a pattern, and it's a very common pattern. It's not something that is restricted to the early Islamic context or the 7th century or something. It's something, for instance, we also see in a Roman context. So soldiers who, for instance, after the end of a war, were basically dropped from that version of the Diwan. A lot of them were out of the way of making a living, and so a lot of the bandits we read about in the Roman countryside, for instance, Roman as in the entire Roman Empire, not just Italy. A lot of them were former soldiers who had to make their living a different way. So it's a very common phenomenon. So it wouldn't be strange to see a process like this.
Oh, I definitely agree because the one thing that reading the chapter by Chase Robinson, which really popped up in my mind, especially when he equated Salih ibn al-Masari and Shabib ibn Yazid to Habsbamian bandits.
Mm-hmm.
Robin Hood popped up in my mind. Robin
Yeah,
Hood, Zorro,
yeah,
a whole list of
yeah,
figures
yeah,
who I saw a lot of similarities.
yeah.
So my question is, what are your thoughts on seeing Salih ibn al-Masari and Shabib as Habsbamian or social bandits within their context? Would you agree with that, or is that just a little bit too romanticized, overly romanticized view of their revolts and what they stood for?
I mean, Hobsbawm's concept or notion of social banditry has received a lot of criticism over the last 50 or so years. I mean, sometimes they are presented in a way that is kind of reminiscent of the type of social bandit that Hobsbawm describes as, so basically hero figures. Sometimes in interactions, for instance, with local communities, and interestingly, especially Dhimmi communities. There's one report which I think Robinson also talks about of basically Shabib being welcomed by a Christian town who open their gates to him and say, "We prefer you because you are just and you don't commit the kind of tyranny that the Umayyads do, so we prefer you." So that is kind of reminiscent. It's hard to say what these revolts stood for, which makes it difficult to really speak to that. And of course, there is very much the difference between what was actually happening on the ground and then its representation. So I think the representation, as I said, sometimes evokes the sort of image of a social bandit. Whether that is what was going on at the time on the ground is difficult to say. I mean, for someone like Shabib, I mean, the kind of like he strikes you as a kind of like bandit hero, like, adventure tale sort of figure, not necessarily a Robin Hood type of figure, like this taking from the rich, giving to the poor sort of thing, looking after local communities.
I mean, I guess because Robin Hood was a soldier in the part of the
Yeah,
Crusades,
yeah,
and he became disillusioned by that
yeah,
aspect of
sure,
life and
sure.
turned to the Sherwood Forest and
Well, yes, if depending on what you make of that story, yes, no, but it's difficult to say. I mean, like these figures. I mean, we shouldn't forget also that these figures they're not modern inventions, obviously. I mean, they've existed for a very long time, these narrative figures. And so it perhaps isn't unusual to see some cast in those roles, and to see, I mean, we need explanatory paradigms. So it's perhaps not surprising to see certain people and certain events cast, according to certain narrative patterns. Which doesn't mean that it's all that it's all untrue or lies or anything, but it's a particular way of seeing and of presenting history.
Yeah.
So that's something we always need to we always need to keep in the back of our minds, and we do the same, of course. But we need to be aware of the fact that we're all doing it.
And you
Mm.
pointed this out in your book under a footnote. I think you were
Mm.
referencing Najim Hader from his
Yeah.
book. I can't remember exactly, but that the way that we understand history today, the way that we write history today, is not exactly how history has been written throughout our history.
Mm.
We also need to keep that in mind when we look at historical narratives from the past. To say that these people were lying or fabricating things might be a bit uncharitable
Oh
to
yeah,
their
absolutely.
intentions
Yeah,
behind what
yeah,
they were
yeah,
doing.
yeah. No,
So,
absolutely, absolutely. I don't think lying or forging is, you know, is at all the right way of describing this process. Not at all. What is interesting with Saleh and Shabib and their followers and the other sort of smaller uprisings that then continue in the Jazeera is that, again, you have a very clear tribal factor. So again, like most of them are Banu Shaiban, some of them are Yashkur, but all of these belong to Bakr and Wa'il, who again are a northern tribal group. And it's very, I mean, it's very clear. And in Jazeera in particular, the revolts also seem to be sort of like passed down from generation to generation.
yeah.
So you get
Shabib's
fathers and
son.
sons,
Yeah.
uncles and nephews, cousins, brothers, who, you know, as part of the same rebel groups, or as sort of like passing on the legacy. So again, it's almost kind of like a regional or sort of tribal or family tradition of Kharijism, which also invites us to ask questions about what this means. It's difficult to say what Kharijism might have meant to these people. I mean, it depends on the kind of definition that we apply. So our definition of Kharijism, there are certainly several. Which, and they may not have much to do with what people at the time thought they were doing. But I mean, personally, to me, the fact that we have these very clear patterns in tribal composition, geographical distribution, family connections, also a very, very diverse sort of pool of people who either turned Kharijite or supported Kharijite revolts, suggests that the kind of simplistic image that you sometimes still read and hear about, of them basically being these super religious, super pious fanatics, you know, excessive in everything they did, heretics and so on and so forth, doesn't really fit what we see in the sources. And I think part of that is because scholarship also tends to focus on the really spectacular militant Kharijites. But there are so many varieties of Kharijism, so many different ways in which someone could be a Kharijite, you know, even temporarily, or support a Kharijite revolt because, you know, it perhaps accorded with your own intentions, your own aims, even though you didn't necessarily share much of a doctrinal or ideological basis. And I think I think the variety gets lost sometimes when we focus only on, you know, on Shabib, on the Azarika, on Nahrawan, and so on and so forth. And especially for Kharijism in the early Abbasid period, we know almost nothing. I think